Hello. We are again looking at the subject of why preterism. Preterism, of course, is the belief that many or all of the end times, supposedly scriptures, prophecies are already fulfilled. There's three general categories. Full preterism, which says that every prophecy in the entire Bible is fulfilled, including the second coming. That also means that the bodily resurrection is not real, that it's a spiritual resurrection. This is called full preterism. This is not what I'm talking about. That's considered heresy by most Bible teachers. There are forms of orthodox preterism that don't get into such extremes, but they are all called under the same label of preterism. The typical version of preterism is usually what's considered 70 AD preterism. They say that all, or the majority of the scriptures, not all of them, not the second coming, not several others, that most of them were fulfilled in 70 AD. I don't feel that the scripture points to this. I don't feel that 70 AD sufficiently fulfills all of the prophecies of, say, Revelation 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. I don't think that Revelation or 70 AD and the events of that time period sufficiently fulfill all of those scriptures. My viewpoint is more towards the bottom, mild preterism. It's still called preterism, but don't get confused with the other two. Mild version of preterism says that most of the prophecies were fulfilled in general within the first few centuries of the church. Of course, the reasons for considering preterism are, first of all, Scripture itself. Second of all, does it have a fulfillment in history? And third of all, how does it fit with the whole Bible and the general theological themes of the Word? We feel that it portrays them very well, and in some cases we think it actually fits them better. So, in this series, we are looking particularly at Scripture, and we're bringing out the other points as we go along in Scripture. We've been spending a good deal of time in the book of Daniel here. And right here, we are at the very end of the book of Daniel in chapter 12, verse 11. Now, this is covering a point of interest that is of extreme focus for many people who consider futurism their view or their methodology for interpreting Scripture, because this deals with what is called the Abomination of Desolation. Now, a lot of people have their theories about what this is. A lot of people go into a lot of detail about what this is or should be in their minds. However, let it be pointed out, Scripture in no place clearly identifies what this is. The closest we have are the extra-canonical, non-Holy Bible, not in the canon, the books of the Maccabees, where a statue of Zeus was set up on the altar of sacrifice. This was not in the Holy of Holies. This was the altar of sacrifice in the outer courts. They set up many people say that it's the Holy of Holies, but if you read the Maccabees, it says the altar of sacrifice. The Holy of Holies was the mercy seat. That was not the altar of sacrifice. Animals were sacrificed outside the building on the altar of sacrifice in the outer courts, in the outside. The book of Maccabees, not Scripture, not considered inspired and not authoritative, says that that statue was the abomination of desolation. And that's also some of our point today. While we don't consider that the definition of the abomination of desolation, we believe that it is in the general direction and having to do with it, but we don't consider that to be an authoritative definition of what it is. However, what needs to be pointed out here is this verse. And from that time, this is at the end of Daniel. Daniel has just received all of his visions that he's going to have for the book. He's at the end of his life, and he's receiving this 3-chapter visitation from Daniel 10, 11, and 12. At the end of it, the angel says, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and shall make themselves be white and refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise shall understand." Verse 11, "And from that time the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up. There shall be 1,290 days." Now, I'm going to flip over to the American Standard Version, the ASV. We're reading here from the ESV, as we have in most of the verses here. But I just wanted to point out that here it says that and from the time that the continual the burnt offering here is written in brackets. That means that word is added to the text. It doesn't clearly specify in this verse which sacrifice this was. And that's important because we're going to understand that this is not talking about the general temple sacrifices, as we'll see in a moment. But I just wanted to point out that there are some differences in interpretation, and the American Standard Version is fairly word for word, but sometimes the English Standard Version, which is also a word for word translation, is simply a little more readable. But here it says the burnt offerings, and that's a little misleading because that's not specifically in the text. That's added for our clarity. It's just a technicality of translational thing. You have to do something to give it clarity. But this phrase, the abomination of desolation, or the abomination that makes desolate, is probably a better way to put it, as it puts here in the English Standard Version. This is referenced 4 times in the book of Daniel, according to some people. I would say that it is probably only referenced 3 times, but we will cover all the 4 times that most people say this is referenced in the book of Daniel. And going over them really quick, we have here in Daniel 12, verse 11, here, we have Daniel 8, verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning of the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary to be trampled underfoot? So it's speaking of there, the transgression that makes desolate is the phrase we're looking at. That's a rough translation of, right there, that's abomination of desolation in similar language. The other clear example of this is Daniel 11:31. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. This is Daniel 11:35. The other one that's often considered a reference to it, which I would disagree with, is Daniel 9, verse 27. At the end of this prophetic encounter with Gabriel, Gabriel says, "And he shall make a covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate, until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator." And this is more the general sense of what is actually being here. Some of the translations, such as the NIV, translate this last phrase, and so it looks like, and on the wing of the temple, they add the word temple there in their interpretation, on a wing he shall set an abomination that makes desolate, they say. However, in the text here that's being translated, there's a couple textual variations just throughout history. A couple letters have changed, but in the textual variations that are going on here, you would actually have to add a letter here, and this seems to be the more correct translation, the desolator, that it's not an abomination that makes desolate. It is, on the wing of abominations comes one who makes desolate, until the end is one who makes desolate, until the end decreed is poured on the desolator. So while some people consider this a reference to the abomination of desolation, it does not seem, in the studies I've done, I haven't looked at it in super depth, but there is some concern about the language and what's being translated, about whether that's actually referring to the same thing or not. These are all in reference, of course, if we flip over into the book of Matthew. This is Matthew chapter 24, in what is considered the Olivet Discourse. And this is why many people consider the abomination of desolation to be such an important thing. As Jesus speaks here, he says in verse 15, down at the bottom, "When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand." Now, the next phrase, I just want to call your attention to real quick. The instructions after you see this are, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." But the thing to watch for is, so when you see the abomination of desolation. Now, the Olivet Discourse is repeated in 2 other places. In Mark's Gospel, it is in the 13th chapter, and it follows very similar to the one in Matthew. When you get down to verse 14, Mark 13, verse 14, "When you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Now I want you to see particularly, while the phrase at the end, "let those who are in the mountains flee in Judea, flee to the mountains," when we come over to Luke's gospel, which is the third account of this, and I consider these all to be parallel. They are all the same description of what's going on. They all bring out different details, but they all cover the same basic talk that Jesus was having with his disciples about what was to come. But in Luke's account, it's a little bit different. At the end, in verse 21, of course, it says, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, but the sign to watch for here is different." And that's what I wanted to point out really quick. In Luke's gospel, it says, when you see not the abomination of desolation, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So in Matthew and Mark, it says when you see the abomination of desolation, those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. However, in Luke's gospel, chapter 21, it says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." And so these are the particular reference points for looking at. But what the important thing to realize is for the minds of many Jews, they already knew in their minds what the abomination of desolation was, because the Maccabees were from the period between the Testaments or before the time of Christ. So in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, the first one of these that we looked at in the New Testament, the Olivet Discourse, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, we have an interesting conundrum here, because in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, a few hundred years before the time of Christ, Antiochus is the one who set up the image or the idol of Zeus on the altar of sacrifice. So in the minds of many Jews, this was a well-known, already occurred event. This was an event that had already taken place. And that's part of the typology. Now, many people would adopt several different strategies, and ours is perhaps a little bit unique, but we feel that it's supported by the text, if not immediately obvious by it. Many people would go the route of dual fulfillment. They would actually use this as the prime example of dual fulfillment, that the topic of abomination of desolation, since it was a past event, and now Jesus, since it was 400 years before Jesus is now here speaking of it as a future event. They would say that this means that the abomination is repeated, that it was fulfilled in one sense in the past, but that was only a foreshadowing of the greater one to come. Now, I subscribed to this ideology for quite some time, but I've come to a slightly different position, because while this is the verse that's usually the go-to verse for establishing the repetition of prophecy, that this happened at one time and it's happening again in the future, while this is the go-to verse, this concept of dual fulfillment of prophecy is not really supported anywhere else in Scripture. It's actually supported by this case. Many people use this case to try to support it in other places, but that's a different story. And so we have to look here, what is going on with this abomination of desolation? Now, our key verse is coming from Daniel 12, verse 11. But first, I want to look at the other two. We're not going to look too much at the Daniel 9. I just wanted to point that one out. But I wanted to look at the other two cases of the abomination of desolation. The first one was Daniel chapter 8. In Daniel chapter 8 is Daniel's vision of the ram with two horns and the goat. Now, through the chapter, the ram had two big horns, and it was going throughout the earth, and the goat came across without barely touching the ground, hit him, broke off his horns, and then now the goat was in power. What the interpretation given for this dream was that the ram symbolized the Medes and the Persians. Now, the goat, on the other hand, represented the kingdom of Greece. So if we remember from Daniel chapter 2, we have the four-part statue. And this is the paradigm for the entire book of Daniel, is this four-part statue. And so we know that the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar. You are the head of gold, Daniel chapter 2, verse 38. Daniel identifies it. Next we come to the Medes and the Persians, because they are the ones who conquered Babylon. In Daniel chapter 5, when Belshazzar has his feast with the consecrated vessels from God's holy temple, Daniel tells him, the word of the Lord, that your kingdom will be taken from you and given to the Medes and Persians. So we know that the arms and the chest of silver is the second kingdom, or the Medes and the Persians. And that's what's represented. That's what's represented over here with the ram. And so this chapter represents the transition from the second to the third kingdom. And again, going back over here, the bronze and the legs, we know from Daniel chapter 8 that this transition here from the silver to the bronze is from the Medes and the Persians, which took it from Babylon, to the kingdom of Greece, which is identified over here in Daniel chapter 8. And so we see this interchange between the ram and the goat. And as we're coming down, we read in verse 9 here, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly towards the south and the east and towards the glorious land. Now, some people would try to equate this little horn with the horn from Daniel chapter 7. They would try to say that since both of them use the word little, that they must be the same entity. However, we find that this is an extremely, for lack of a better word, little correspondence. Little simply designates something about its strength or its ability to rule. Horns often symbolized rulers or strength. And so little is simply a diminutive term. There's not really a great level of identification to say that one little horn has to be the same other little horn. So we do not see a connection between the two. But it's just simply pointed out that some people do. We just don't think that the word little is big enough to warrant a justifiable connection. But this little horn, it grew great even to the host of heaven, threw down some stars, it became great, the hosts were given to it. And finally down in 13, for how long is the vision concerning the burnt offering and the transgression and the giving over the sanctuary to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. So Antiochus Epiphanes, he defiled the temple. He sacrificed pigs on the altar, desecrating it. And by historical record, 2,300 evenings and mornings, divide that in half, the number of days, and you have the precise time frame that the sanctuary was defiled from the time that Antiochus defiled it to the time that it was restored to its rightful state. Now there's two things that you must notice here. Here, how long from the transgression that makes desolate and to be trampled underfoot, and it is said 2,300 evenings and mornings, and the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. Second of all, you must notice that this is only in the context of the shaggy goat. Daniel 8 deals with the ram with two horns and the goat represents Greece. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes was a Greek emperor. He was therefore of the third kingdom here. And so what this is talking about an abomination of desolation occurring specifically, according to Daniel chapter 8, specifically occurring in the third kingdom. And that's important, obviously, because this is a few hundred years before Christ came on the scene. And this is what's going on in Daniel chapter 8. Again, the whole principle of dual fulfillment is coming out of this abomination talk. And what we're looking here to do is look at another plausible explanation. So before we come to our conclusions, let's go look at Daniel chapter 11. This is Daniel chapter 11. Now, Daniel chapter 11, verse 31 is where we're going to. But it begins, of course, at the top. It begins with Persia and then goes quickly to Greece. 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a fourth shall be far richer than them, and then Greece. And then it starts going on down through the mighty king, which is Alexander the Great. He's divided to the 4 winds of heaven. He died at a young age, and his kingdom was given to his 4 generals. And then you're coming down here, and it's chronicling very accurately in prophecy the various rulers of the kingdom of Greece. until you get down to verse number 20 here. And then shall arise in his place and exact tribute for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger and battle. In his place shall rise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning, and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies will be utterly swept away before him, and broken, even be the prince of the covenant. And from that time an alliance is made with him. He shall act deceitfully, and become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers and it goes on and on. As for their two kings, their hearts are bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies, but to no avail. He shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his works and return to his own land. So again, the individual, this is beginning to focus on one particular individual that will severely oppress Israel. And this is the same Antiochus Epiphanes. Now again, remember, when we're talking about the kings of the north and the kings of the south, that's a reference back to verse 4, which is talking about the four generals of Alexander are spread out to the 4 points of the compass, or the 4 winds of heaven. So when it speaks of the kings of the north and the kings of the south, we are specifically talking about ancient Greece. And Antiochus Epiphanes is one of these kings. This is talking about him, and it's really a parallel and a magnification and an enlargement of what had been set forth in Daniel chapter 8. As Daniel chapter 8 was about the second kingdom and the third kingdom, Daniel chapter 11, while it starts at the second kingdom, because that's the reference of Daniel, it really focuses on Daniel, or on the third kingdom and the fourth kingdom. That again, in the statue, this is Daniel chapter 8, looking at these two kingdoms, and Daniel chapter 11 is looking at these two kingdoms, with the transition right here at about verse 36. But the overlap right here, these two kingdoms and these two kingdoms, the overlap here is Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greek Empire. And it shall be at the appointed time he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For the ships of Kittim, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offerings, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. This is again talking about the same thing that Daniel 8, verse 13, I believe it was talking about. This is, again, since the transition to Rome is down in verse 36, the transition from the third kingdom down to the fourth kingdom, this is solidly in the third kingdom, in the bronze waist and thighs. This is in Greece. So what we have here is Daniel 8 and Daniel 11, both are solidly referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, the couple hundred years before Christ, the well-known abomination of desolation that occurred according to these two chapters. But let me flip back over to the Daniel chapter 8 reference again. This is Daniel 8:13, the one we just looked at. And he said to me, the verse right after it, verse 14, and he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. And that's the part we need to look at. Now we know that Jesus, these events are a past event for Jesus. When he's talking in Matthew 24, these are past events. And yet he refers to the abomination of desolation as an event yet to come. So what is he getting at? Is he talking about dual fulfillment, or is he getting at something else? Well, right here in verse 14, it says, then the sanctuary shall be returned to its rightful state. Now bear with me a moment. This is Daniel chapter 12, verse 11 once again. And from that time, the regular burnt offering is taken away. Again, that burnt offering isn't really burnt offering. It says the continual sacrifice. The word offering there is completely added by the translator simply to try to make it make more sense to us. Is taken away, and the abomination that desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. But what is the context of this? We're looking back again At Daniel chapter 12, verse 7, right before that, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, that it would be for time, times, and half a time, that the power of the holy people would come to an end or be utterly shattered. And this is the difference between these two references. It goes on, I heard but I didn't understand. And then I said, oh Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? And he said, so now we're looking at the outcome. Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves, and shall make themselves white and refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, and those who are wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, I'm substituting different translations words in here, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest and stand in your allotted place at the end of days. So the comparison I want to make and point out is in Daniel 8 again. This is switching back to Daniel 8. He said, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. That's the context of the Daniel 3, the third kingdom abomination of Daniel 8 and Daniel 13. And I think maybe you can guess at what I'm getting at. Over here in Daniel 12, the outcome is different. It is not the restoration of the tabernacle to its rightful state. But what we have here is we see that the power of the holy people is utterly shattered. What Daniel is asking here is, what will be the outcome of these things? That's what he's asking in verse 8 here. And he's told to go his way, for the words are sealed. But from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination of that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. So this is not the time between the sacrifice being taken away and the abomination, but from the time of them both until what? What is the outcome? What is the end of all these things? From that time, presumably until the end, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits until arrives at the end at the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest in your allotted place. So, for the most part, we have been sticking strictly to Bible references, but here we have to step into a little bit of history. As you could see from Daniel 8 and 11, those abominations are clearly in the third kingdom Greece. So not only do you have to do dual fulfillment, you have to pull them out of context and place them into the fourth kingdom. You have to place them not here where the text says it is. You have to place them here. But more than that, where Daniel 8 says that then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful place after the abomination, in Daniel 12, the context of Daniel's question in 8 is Daniel 7, that the power of the holy people would come to an end. And as we've covered throughout this in other places, up in Daniel 11 verse 36, it talks about until the time of the indignation is over, until that which is decreed is accomplished. And so what we see in my perspective at this point, my perspective has changed as I've studied this out, but in my perspective as I've studied this out and where I'm at now, is that Daniel 12 verse 11, the abomination here, is the abomination at the end. And the abomination in Daniel 8 and 11 is fulfilled. What is the difference and what is the textual clue that makes it clearer, if I am correct? It is right here that this abomination is, after this abomination, after 2,300 evenings and mornings, the sanctuary is restored to its rightful state. However, in Daniel 12, the outcome is what Daniel was asking about in Daniel 8, which is the shattering of the power of the holy people. And what is the shattering of the power of the holy people in this particular preterist mindset? It is, of course, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, when the way of the Jews came to an end. You cannot follow the law of Moses without the temple or the tabernacle of Moses. And that was destroyed in 70 AD. So what of these time frames? What of this 1,290 days and the 1,335 days? Well, this is, of course, interpretation, and one has to look at history for these things. One can't look at strictly biblical sources, because these are not recorded in the Bible, but they are well established in history, certain portions of these. What is clear from history is that from exactly this time period, 1,290 days, which is 45 short of the 1,335 days, there was 1,290 days between a certain event and the destruction of the temple. This event was the ending of the continual daily sacrifices for Caesar. Now just follow with me a second and consider. The Bible doesn't actually say burnt offerings. This is a interpreter's model. They put their understanding trying to make it more readable to us. I appreciate translators, but sometimes men get it wrong. It is the Bible in its original form which is infallible, and that alone. And so when we see the continual or the daily sacrifices, it says, as it said in the American Standard, it said the continual. But when the daily sacrifice, which daily sacrifice? Well, it's not really saying. And the abomination that makes desolate set up. Well, what is the abomination of desolation? As I said, the scripture doesn't say. We've got the book of Maccabees, which calls the idol that Zeus put up on the altar of sacrifice, it calls that the abomination of desolation. But that's not, again, the definition, because that's not the authority. It is probably related to that. One probably couldn't get too far away from that, but that's where we look. And so what happened in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, they basically took over the Temple Mount. They desecrated it and made it something that it was not. They replaced the spiritual place of worship within the heart of the city, within the heart of the nation, with pagan idolatry. And the crowning achievement, of course, was that it was symbolized by placing that idol of Zeus upon the temple. But do we have anything else that happens in the future, after Jesus' time, in this time frame of the fourth kingdom? And in fact, we do. At the time of Eleazar, the priest who stopped the sacrifices, it was Eleazar ben Hananiah. When he stopped the daily sacrifices to Caesar, that was an act of war. That was basically a declaration of an act of war. That's how it was interpreted. That's what the historical record records it as. From that point, it was that point that the rebels went into the Temple Mount and used God's holy temple, the place of worship at the center of the city, at the center of the nation, and they set that up as their rebel, warring, bloodletting capital, as their fortress. They made the temple itself their fortress. It is in this way, while the idol of Zeus was probably the pinnacle symbol of the abomination of desolation, of them desecrating the place and the heart of worship by replacing it with pagan idolatry. In the same way, when the rebel leaders set themselves up in the temple of God, declaring who the priests were and doing the things that only God should be doing, they actually assigned people to be priests that shouldn't have been priests at all. One person even declared himself king for a little while towards the end of the siege. But these two things happened at the same time. They stopped the daily sacrifice, not the regular burnt offerings. They stopped the daily sacrifice, and they took over the place of worship, and in essence, with their bloodletting, they desecrated the temple and the Temple Mount, and making it a sanctuary for war instead of a sanctuary for worship. And so it's in this way that when Jesus is speaking in our interpretation, when Jesus is speaking in Matthew 24, then, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, what has happened? The rebel strongholds, they went into the temple and locked themselves in. They took over the temple. Now, the other interesting point of this is also the time that Eleazar ben Hananiah, the rabbi, stopped the daily sacrifices. And so we have both of these that are pointed in here. From the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, it doesn't say which sacrifice, and the abomination that desolation is set up, if that is the desecration of the temple. The only other sign that's really here being pointed at is the Luke version. Instead of referencing the abomination of desolation, we see when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. And here's where it is really gets to the point. It's not super well known, but this is exactly what happened in the siege of Jerusalem. Anyone who studied the siege of Jerusalem would know this, but it's not a common knowledge in modern Christendom. When they basically declared war, they knew there was an uprising in Jerusalem. One of the Roman generals came, and he actually came up to the city walls and began to surround it. But after a few days, without very much reason at all, he turned and withdrew his entire force, and the Jewish rebels from the city pursued the Roman army for miles and miles as they fled towards the Mediterranean from Jerusalem, and killed many of the Roman soldiers as they fled. Now, there wasn't any real reason except for the providence of God and except for this prophecy of Jesus. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. And this is exactly what it was. This was the final warning. This was the final call that they were looking for. Number one, the daily sacrifice is taken away. Number two, the place of worship in even the temple itself, and who knows what they did to the altars, history isn't a complete record, these were taken over for tyranny and war. And on top of that, you have a Roman army come up and surround the entire city, and then for no explicable reason, they could have stayed there as long as they wanted and built siege works right then, but they didn't. For no particular reason that even Josephus points out, it was nothing but the providence of God. They withdrew and fled, and that was the sign. These were all the sign to the believers who knew the words of Christ, knew Christ's prophecy on the Mount of Olives here in the Olivet Discourse. They knew that was the time, as it says, to then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. This was the time that many Christians fled, and they fled to a city called Pella, many historians record. They fled en masse, and some people say that even no Christians were harmed in the catastrophe that came to Israel and to Jerusalem that ensued. The Christians were preserved because they heeded the words of prophecy. Now, a lot of this may be a lot to take in for a lot of people who are looking at a lot of these things, but just consider them and weigh them out. As you look at the other parts of this that fit in, and as you look at them, this has some significant consequences. You have in Matthew 24, you have the sign to watch for. Then the end, when you see the abominations of desolation spoken by the prophet Daniel, that this is already accomplished. And what does that mean? It means that verses like before, verse 14, are accomplished. This gospel of the kingdom shall be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Well, when did that happen? Well, apparently it had happened by Colossians 1, because Colossians 1, verses 23, says, this gospel has been preached to all creatures under heaven. And there's also another verse that also corroborates that. And I guess if you don't want to take the Colossians 1:23 as verbatim literal, I suppose however literal you want to take this one, you could take the other one. The point is the gospel had been preached to the entire world. Paul and the other missionaries had preached it throughout the whole world. And when you realize that Matthew 24 is actually largely fulfilled, and we'll definitely get more into this as we go along, then we also see that Matthew 24 verses 21, then there will be great tribulation. And this is, of course, 70 AD. This is the same 70 AD that was Daniel 12, verse 1. And this is accomplished in the first century. And so the key here is to look that the context of this abomination is, first of all, the shattering of the power of the holy people. But more important than that, the Daniel 8 and the Daniel 11, this is the Daniel 8 one, Daniel 8 speaks of a restoration afterwards. They speak of a restoration afterwards that the Daniel 12 version does not even mention. And so, the abomination of desolation here, the abomination that makes desolate, in our understanding, the reason that Jesus is referring to it as a future event is because he is now referring to the Daniel 12 verse 11 abomination. Everyone knew what the Daniel 8 and the Daniel 11 abominations were, but that desolation was with restoration. Now we are looking at the abomination of desolation that ends with the shattering of the power of the holy people. And that's the outcome. What shall be the outcome of these things? And he's told, go your way, the words are shut up and sealed. And so we see two abominations. We see the abomination in the Third Empire, and we see the abomination in the Fourth Empire. We do not see any case for dual fulfillment, and while the evidence for it is scant, perhaps I would love to have more weight for this position. This interpretation certainly fits with history. It certainly fits with the preterist interpretation of biblical prophecy. But more than that, it does not establish another extraneous doctrine of dual fulfillment. Nowhere else in Scripture is there any other clear example of dual fulfillment. Whenever you hear about dual fulfillment, they always point back to Matthew 24, verse 15. When you shall see the abomination of desolation, well, surely that must be a dual fulfillment. So if God can do it there, he's going to do it in other places. Well, we should perhaps reconsider. That's probably enough on this one. Again, this is not totally scripture, but we must look at some historical references as well. I believe that this is an ample explanation of what is going on here, and I believe that it fits the pattern because to the Jew and every Jew in Jesus' day, the abomination of desolation was a well-known fact. It wasn't something of obscure history. This was something very personal to the Jews, the desecration of their temple and its restoration. But here in Daniel 12, we see something very different. We do not see talk about a restoration. We talk about a shattering of the power. We see the same thing as abomination, and our mind can connect it to the other two previous ones, which are also in the third kingdom. But God promised a fourth kingdom. He promised that there were 4 kingdoms here, not just 3. And both of the other previous were referenced here. And so now in Daniel chapter 12, we are looking here at the end. And just as we covered just in Daniel 11:36, talking about the beginning of Rome, he must prosper until the time of indignation is complete. And so here we are apparently in the 4th empire, and that sets it apart from the other 2 examples. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoy this and other videos. Thanks. Bye.